My apologies for the false start, but welcome Math 105 to week 3 of our live streams for the semester. This week is Logic Week, and my subtitle for today's material is How to Win an Argument, or at least feel like you should have won an argument. What we're going to be talking about this week is how mathematicians and philosophers have taken sort of what they see as the core parts of logical reasoning and operationalize them, turn them into something that from time to time can kind of look like mathematics, but really it's more about an analytical way of thinking, an analytical way of understanding how material in an argument is being presented to you so that you can decide for yourself whether or not to believe what you're being told. After all, the whole point of somebody making an argument is to convince you of something, right? To convince you that some premise or some conclusion is true. And really the process of learning, the process of thinking critically about the world around us is a process of learning and deciding what to believe, what to put our stake in. And so logical reasoning really is at the heart of thinking critically. And if there's one thing that you do better on your way across the stage when you graduate with a bachelor's degree than when you came in as a freshman, I think that thinking critically has got to be at the top of that list because we live in a world that's drenched with information and people trying to make points about things everywhere, from business to government to the workplace to your classrooms to the media, the newspapers, your Twitter feed is just jam-packed with people trying to convince you of things. And not all of their arguments that they're making are logical. And so what we're going to be assigned to do today is to kind of pare down to the bare essentials, the necessities. What does it mean to argue logically? And what do valid forms of logical reasoning look like? In other words, when must I believe an assertion that's being made to me? Like, what's the burden of proof that somebody that I'm having a discussion with has to meet in order to convince me logically that a statement is true? And I should say that logical reasoning is not the only way to change people's minds or to convince people of something in the world. There are a lot of arguments that are not logical. There are arguments that are emotional, that are practical, that are pragmatic. There are all sorts of other, what logicians call appeals, philosophers call appeals. Appeals to emotion, for example. Appeals to authority. Believe this because I'm more powerful than you. There are different ways to try and convince somebody of something. But the ways we're specifically looking at this week are the logical ways. And the logical ways take the person out of it, they take the emotions out of it, and make an effort, at least, to disentangle from all of the human features that surround the making of an argument, and figure out what are the core philosophical principles behind the argument that's being made. And if you, as somebody listening to my argument, if you believe my premises in the argument, must you believe the conclusion that I'm making? Do you have to come along with me to the conclusion of my argument because you came along with me through the first premises? So that's essentially what we're trying to look at this week. If you're a Bridgewater student in my class this semester, chances are you either have already taken or maybe you're taking right now one of our more common required courses at BSU, which is the Foundations of Logical Reasoning. That's a course that's taught out of the philosophy department, that's generally taken at the freshman or sophomore level. And that course spends a whole semester really tackling these sort of touchy topics about sort of what does sound logical argument, valid logical argument form, what does it look like? And then in that class, you also get to spend a lot more time thinking about, well, what are the different invalid forms of logical reasoning that we encounter all the time without maybe realizing that they're invalid? Those are called logical fallacies, and we'll have a little bit of time today to talk about some fallacies that are more common along the way. But we want to focus on really 2 or 3 of the most important bits that we're going to do this week with logic. The first is to talk about logical propositions. So what is it that makes something logic as opposed to something else, right? How is an appeal to logic different than an appeal to emotion or an appeal to authority or anything like that? Then second, we want to talk about logical connectives, ways of taking logical propositions and combining them together into new propositions. This is the place this week where you're going to understand more about why we spent the time that we spent thinking about sets in the earlier part of the course, because everything we did with sets at the level of operations like unions, intersections, complements, those all have direct analogs when we think about the operations we can do with logical propositions. The most thorny of these 4 that we're going to look at, ands, ors, nots, and if-then, If-then is probably the most challenging, so I would definitely want to make sure we spend some extra time thinking about if-then forms of logical reasoning. I actually, just an hour ago, was teaching my math majors class, abstract algebra, so it's a junior level math majors course. And one of the things that mathematicians do on a day-to-day basis is that they have to argue for the truth of if-then structured statements. So if x is an even number, then 3x is also an even number. So there are a lot of statements like that power a lot of the mathematical enterprise, and it's because mathematics rests on a foundation of logic. And if-thens are probably the most fundamental kind of logic because they let us, once we understand that a premise holds, then if the conditional if-then statement is true, the conclusion must also hold. So a lot of how we reach conclusions in mathematics is also powered by if-then logical assertions. Then I want to talk about quantifiers. Quantifiers are another sticky wicket, and I'll be honest that math majors also have challenge sort of taking apart quantifiers because we think about them a lot. They come up in conversation a lot, but we don't always slow down and take a moment to think about, well, what does the purpose of this quantifier actually mean in a sentence? So if I say, for example, all BSU students think that parking on campus is a disaster, or something like that, right? Well, very secretly, I've slipped in a quantifier, the word all, into that statement. And the function of that word in the statement might have been, if I were saying all BSU students, maybe I didn't mean literally everybody, maybe I meant, well, a majority. But that's not, from a logical standpoint, what the word all means. Because one of the things that characterizes logic is that every proposition in logic is either true or it's false, meaning that it's either provable or it's falsifiable. Once we know that a statement is true, then it must not be false, and vice versa. Once we know that a statement is false, we know that it must not be true. And every logical proposition is one or the other of those two things. And so what logic does that's kind of helpful from an analytical perspective is it sets a very high standard of what it means for something to be true. From a human perspective, sometimes that's not always appropriate. Right? There are a lot of shades of gray that exist when we reason about topics and conversations in the real world. But often the logic can suggest sort of where the preponderance of the evidence needs to rest in making a logical argument about something that may not necessarily be black and white. This is a theme that we're going to come back to again when we talk about statistical reasoning in the last act of our course, so as we get along into April or so. And then finally, probably what the part of this material that most excites me is being able to assess an argument for whether or not its form is valid. This is a little different than assessing whether or not an argument is true. What you're doing when you're assessing the form of an argument for validity is asking the question, if I grant you your premises, so if your premises are true, do I need to grant you your conclusion? So if the things that you said at the beginning are true, does your conclusion also have to be true, logically? That's really the question. And it's probably the most challenging skill in this arena because it requires us to pull all of these different topics together. Understand what are propositions, how to use connectives to combine them together, specifically if-thens and quantifiers, and then when we get a convergence of those things into an argument, how do we assess whether that argument follows a valid form? And therefore, if we grant the premises, we must grant the conclusion. So that's sort of the high-level outline of what that we want to do today. So let's get started by just taking a moment to understand the difference between logic and not logic. So as I mentioned, not every argument that we're exposed to in our lives is a logical argument. So what makes logical arguments special is that high standard, that high burden of proof that I was talking about a few minutes ago. And that high burden of proof is set up by the following requirement. A logical proposition, these are the raw materials of logical reasoning. A logical proposition must be a statement that is either one of two things. A proposition can be true. And from a mathematics perspective, we also like to think of that which is true as that which is provable. Something that I can directly show you using logical reasoning must be true as a result of previous things that we agreed were true. Or, of course, the other option is false. And again, from the mathematician's perspective, we like to think of things that are false as being things that are falsifiable. Things which I can demonstrate are false. Right? Because that's what the logical reasoning enterprise is about. It's about what can you show me is true, must be true, and what can you show me must not be true. A lot of logical thinking is black and white in this way, because there's no gray area between true and false in formal one sort of predicate logic, the kind that we're doing this semester. There is a whole field of study called fuzzy logic, in which case statements can have various ranges of truth values between true and false, and that opens a lot of new doors. And a lot of artificial intelligence, for example, is based around fuzzy logic. If you have a programmable thermostat in your house, for example, like a Nest wired thermostat, those systems learn your behavior over time. And in order to learn human behavior well enough to be able to predict it at some level, they use fuzzy logic in order to do that. That's not the realm that we're going to play in, though. For us, we are in the black and white 0 and 1 world, in which a logical proposition is something that is either definitely true or it is definitely false. There's no in between, and every logical proposition is one of those things or the other. So examples of things that are logical propositions are things like BSU requires students to complete 120 credits to graduate. That's a logical proposition, because either that's a true statement or it's not a true statement. Right? It's either true or it's false. I can go into the BSU catalog and I can look up all the requirements to graduate with your bachelor's degree. I'll find out that yes, there's a requirement that every student complete a total of 120 or more credits by the time they graduate. That's a logical proposition, because either this thing is true or this thing is not true. Another example of a logical proposition is something like, let's say Mike Pence is the President of the United States. Now, dear viewer, I don't know what day, time, or hour you happen to be watching this video, but as of right now, this statement is not true. Mike Pence is not currently the president. So it's still a logical proposition, however. So one of the novice mistakes in assessing whether something is a proposition or not is that the truth of it doesn't matter. It just matters that it is either provable or falsifiable. That either it's totally false or it's totally true. Not every logical proposition must be true. It just has to be for sure, for certain, in one of those two categories of truth or falsehood, or the other. An example of something which is not a logical proposition might be something which is a matter of opinion, right? So the Patriots are the best team in football. So on its face, this feels like a matter of opinion. Granted, in New England, maybe not. This is probably an opinion that's widely shared across the viewership in New England. But the point is that we can't say for sure that this is definitely a true statement or definitely a false statement, right? It's because it's a matter of opinion. It lives in this sort of other zone of existence. It's not. I wouldn't call it a logical proposition. On the other hand, if we define the terms a little more carefully, we might be able to make a logical proposition out of it. Because there's a word here, best, right? Where my version of what I look for as the best team in football might be different from your version for what you look for in the best team in football. So words like best, these are kind of qualitative, right? Subjective maybe is a better word to use. So anytime your proposition, your supposed proposition, has some subjective content in it that's a matter of opinion, probably it's not a logical proposition. If I wanted to make it a logical proposition, I might have to agree with my interlocutor on a definition of what the word best actually means. We could say something like, maybe best means winningest since the year 2010, or something like that. So if I change the statement to remove that subjective word and put in an objective, testable, provable, or falsifiable criterion, Now, I think I do have a logical proposition. Because we can do a little bit of research. Right? Are the Patriots indeed the winningest team in football since the year 2010? Either that is a true statement, or that is a false statement. And whichever one of those it is, and I'm not going to do the research right now, dear viewer, you can if you like, that definitely now is a logical proposition, because that clause is no longer a subjective matter of opinion, but is now an objective, testable criterion. I can look this up and figure out whether this is a true statement or not. So those are the raw materials of logical reasoning, are logical propositions, things which are definitely true or definitely false. And so the question we want to get to next is, if I know now what logical propositions are, and they can be relatively small, they can be long paragraphs sometimes. If you're going to be a lawyer at some point in your life, the logical propositions you work with as a lawyer are pages, entire books long in some cases. But this is a large part of what lawyers do as a profession, is they try to figure out, first of all, how to make a valid argument to convince a jury or a judge about a conclusion. And then second of all, to be able to analyze and take apart an argument that's being presented by the other side in the case, to point out the flaws and possible fallacies in the arguments that are being made in the courtroom. And so in order to develop that facility, we need to figure out how to put arguments together, how to put logical propositions together to make something that is larger, more interesting, more intricate than the sum of its parts. And so we need to build a repertoire of logical connectives, ways of combining one or more logical propositions and to make a new proposition. Logical connectives are ways of making new propositions from old. So let's start out, because there's going to be 4 main types of connectives that we're going to talk about today. What I want to do is just start out by getting some raw material on the board. Let's just define 3 logical propositions. And I'm going to hope that all 3 of these are propositions. Let me pull an example here real quick. So, all right. Let's call my propositions P, Q, and R. One of the things that we'll get used to in working with the logical reasoning that we work with this week is the idea that a variable here can stand for a logical proposition, just like a variable can stand in for a number when we're doing different kinds of mathematical reasoning. So I'm going to think of P, Q, and R as being 3 logical propositions. Let's let P be the proposition that I have passed. So I want to make sure that this is actually a logical proposition. I have passed Math 105, the course that we're taking this semester. Okay. Q is the proposition I have completed let's say, so this is going to be very BSU shop talk here. I have completed my core curriculum requirements. So that's a logical proposition. Both of these are things that you can test whether they're true or false just by looking at your degree audit inside of DegreeWorks. And then let's say proposition R. I have received my bachelor's degree from BSU. That's something that you can probably also check in a degree audit, or you can check on your wall at home where you have all of your diplomas and everything on the wall and so forth. So here's 3 logical propositions. And each one of these is kind of a self-contained thing. It doesn't look like it's made up of one or more pieces. And so sometimes logicians will call these atomic propositions. It's a single atom. It's just one proposition we can't break apart in any other sort of meaningful ways. And so what we do with atomic propositions is we can combine them together to make what are sometimes called compound propositions. And so what I want to develop today is develop kind of a dictionary of ways of thinking about how do we combine logical propositions together. What are the words that we tend to use in our grammar when we combine those together, when we're just talking? What are the symbols that get used when we're using symbolic logic to represent these combinations? And then, most importantly of all, from a logical perspective, what happens to the truth value of the compound statement. How is the truth value of the compound statement related to the truth values of the original statements? So there's the sort of agenda here. And what I'm going to do in this process is I'm going to use a tool that I'm not ultimately expecting you to use this semester unless you really want to. It's called a truth table. So I'm going to walk through a little bit how we get information into and out of a truth table, but there's probably not a lot that you'll do in your work on Newton Alta, and I'm not going to ask you during the course of a quiz or an exam specifically to use a truth table. But if you find it to be a useful device, use it. If it just baffles you completely, then don't feel like you're going to be held to it this semester. But because this is our first time talking about these ideas, I just want to use it and see. If it's helpful to you, great. If it's not, then feel free to think about this in a different way. So let's talk about our first logical connective, which is the connective called and. So as words, we're going to think of this as the word and. And logicians, when they want to be fancy, they'll call this a conjunction. It's the result of conjoining two logical propositions together. So the word and is the word that gets used in this process. So we have to think about what logically happens when I connect two logical propositions with the word and. So, for example, if I were to take my propositions P and Q up here from the top, I have passed Math 105. I have completed my core curriculum requirements. Join them together using an and. And the symbol that we use for an and is an upside down V. It's kind of a funny symbol. If you're typing it on a keyboard, my sympathies. You can use a slash and a backslash is one way of typesetting this so that it can be understood. You could also use the little caret symbol that's on top of the 6 key. Whatever you like, if you're having a conversation about this with me or Slack or something. It's one of those symbols that is not handy on a keyboard. But that's the symbol that we'd use for it, is P and Q. And so if I were to write that compound proposition, it would sound like this. So I have passed Math 105. And I have completed my core curriculum requirements. Okay. So when we combine two propositions together with an and in the way that we did here, the question that I'm asking, that I'm going to kind of try to use a truth table to explain, is what would it take to prove this statement true? So when, I guess another way to say it is, when is the and statement true? And another way we can get at that question is, when is it not true? What would it take to prove this statement was true? What would it take to prove this statement was false? If you continually ask those questions of yourself the whole way through today's lesson, I think for me that's the key to keeping your logical reasoning straight. So let me write that down here because I'm going to keep referring back to it. Always ask, how would I prove this statement either true or false? After all, that's what a lawyer is doing, right, in the courtroom. If they're making an argument on behalf of their own client, they're constantly thinking, okay, what do I need to do? What evidence do I need to present to demonstrate that my client was innocent, or to demonstrate that the defendant is guilty, right? On the other hand, if you're on the other side of the courtroom, you're listening to an argument, and you might be thinking along the way, all right, how am I going to prove that person is false, right? How am I going to prove that the claim that they're making is not sustainable? So that's my guiding light. Anytime I'm thinking about how to assess logical arguments, I'm always asking, what's the burden of proof? How could I prove this thing true? How could I prove this thing false? So for a conjunction, how would I prove that it's true that I passed Math 105 and I completed the core curriculum? if in order to prove that that statement is true, I need for both of the original assertions to hold. Right? It's not true that I passed Math 105 and completed the core unless I both passed Math 105 as well as completed the core. So, in other words, this is to say that this statement is true exactly when P and Q are both true. So P true and Q is true. So P has to be true, Q has to be true in order for the conjunction P and Q to be true. We need both. And it's false if either one is false, right? If I were on the other side of the courtroom and somebody walked in and said, I passed Math 105 and I completed the core, and I wanted to prove that person wrong, I need to poke a hole in just one of their arguments. Because for them to win the argument, they have to show both statements are true. For me to win the argument, I just have to show that one of their statements is false. So, false in any other case, if either is false. Now, they might both be false, and that too would prove that the conjunction is not true. So it's easier to falsify a conjunction than it is to prove a conjunction. To falsify a conjunction, I just have to show one thing, that one of the two propositions is false. For somebody to prove a conjunction, they have to show that both of the original statements were true. So that's conjunction. And you might notice that the notation for a conjunction, an upside down V, looks an awful lot like a symbol that we've also seen in the world of sets, namely the intersection symbol. So you might also think, when we were talking about sets, I made the recommendation that when you hear the word intersection, you should think about the word and. And this is the reason, that an element belongs to the intersection of two sets if it belongs to one set and it belongs to the other set. And since set membership is by definition a logical proposition, the conjunction of the membership of an element in two sets is exactly how we define membership in the intersection of those two sets. So the set theoretic analog for the conjunction is the intersection. Let's move forward and talk about the next connective. And this next connective is the connective we call OR. So where an AND, in order to prove an AND statement was true, we needed to show that both of the original propositions were true. For the OR, which logicians call a disjunction, for the OR, it's the other way around. So for P or Q, it's the other way around both in the notation, where instead of an upside down V, we'll just use a regular V, usually a really tall, skinny V to represent this. We use the word OR in our sentence. I passed Math 105, or I completed the core. Whoops. Sometimes the word or is also used with the word either for emphasis, but it's not necessarily always there. And again, as opposed to a conjunction where both of my statements have to be true in order to make my statement true, for a disjunction, one is enough. So if I waltz in and I say, hey, I passed Math 105 or I completed the core, right? In order to prove that my statement is true, I only need to prove that one of those statements is true. So one is true. So that's a lower burden of proof than it was for conjunction. For conjunction, for an and, we have to show both ones are true. For a disjunction, it's enough for me to show that one of those statements is true. So even if I made a seemingly ridiculous claim, like, hey, I'm the president of the United States, or I'm a math professor at Bridgewater, right? That's a conjunction because I use the word or in the middle. And it's a true compound statement. It's true that I'm the president of the United States, or I'm a math professor at BSU. But it's true because the second one of those statements is true. And it doesn't matter that the first one, I am the president, is false. As long as one of my two statements is true, that makes the disjunction the or of those statements, a true compound statement. So it doesn't take much to prove that a disjunction, an or statement, is true. And for that reason, the burden of proof to show that it is not true is higher. Because in order to prove that a disjunction is false, we need to show that both of its original statements are false. So again, if you made the claim, hey, either I passed Math 105 or I completed the core, and I'm sitting on the other side of the courtroom saying, no, you didn't, that statement's not true. If I want to prove you wrong, I have to tackle both your assertion that you passed Math 105, show that that's false, and I need to tackle your assertion you completed the core curriculum and show that that's false. Right? So the standard of proof for me, the evidence that I need to provide to show that the or statement does not hold, is I need to show that both parts of the or are false. Right? So however high the burden of proof for a statement to be true is, that's usually how low the burden of proof for it to be false is going to be, and vice versa. If it takes a lot of evidence to prove that something is true, then even one missing brick in that foundation is enough to prove that it's false, and vice versa. So that's disjunctive reasoning. That's the or. And in set land, in the land of sets, the or is really represented by the union. Because an element belongs to the union of two sets if it belongs to either one of those sets or the other. Right? So the very logical connective that we use to define a union of two sets in set theory is the disjunctive connective of set membership in each of those two sets. So anytime you're thinking about a union in sets, you're thinking about the word or. When you think about the word or in the logical propositional calculus, think of the disjunction, the V, the or symbol. All right, so moving on from here, we've so far seen two examples of connectives that join two different sets together, right? Two different logical propositions together, a P and a Q. Our next one is a unary operation. That is to say, it operates only on a single logical proposition, and it's because it's the word not. And this is what logicians would call a negation. Negation coming from the word negative, right? So a not proposition. And as you might expect, the not in the realm of logical reasoning corresponds to the set theoretic complement. When we talked about the complement of a set before, the complement of A consists of all the elements that are not elements of A. So when I negate the logical proposition of set membership in A, I get set membership in A complement. So when you hear the word complement, you thought the word not. Now when you think of the word not, think of the logical, what we call negation. And depending on the author that you look at, some logicians will use different symbols for the not. Let me just really quickly look up and make sure I'm using the one that comports with our text. And our text uses this little squiggle to represent not. So if I do, let's do not R, just to get some variety in our example here. So the negation, it just wedges the word not into my sentence. So if R is the logical proposition, I have received my bachelor's degree from BSU, not R would read something like, I have not received my bachelor's degree. From BSU. Which in my case is correct. I didn't go here as an undergraduate, so for me, not R is a true logical proposition. And that's because, as you might expect, a negation of a logical proposition has exactly the opposite truth value from the original proposition. So a negation is true when the original statement is false, and vice versa. The negation of a statement is false exactly when the original statement is true. And now you can maybe see why in logic we insist on this duality, this binary view that everything is either true or it's false. Everything is either 0 or it's 1. It's either in or it's out, right? And that's because if it were not for that assurance that every statement is exactly one of the two things, true or false, there would be no meaningful way to define what it means to negate a logical proposition, because there's no varying shades of what it means to be true or shades of being false. Everything which is not false is true, and everything which is not true is false. And the negation is the bridge that goes between those two worlds. So a negation is true exactly when the truth value of a negation is exactly the opposite as the truth value of the original. Our last logical connective is the one that we're going to get the most mileage out of. As I was talking about before, this is what the underpinning of a lot of mathematics lies in this logical connective. And I actually kind of want to start, I'm going to start from the end here a little bit. What we're going to seek to generalize here is the concept of subset. When we were talking about subsets before in set theory. Remember the idea of what a subset is. To say that A is a subset of B, let me just take a digression here. A is a subset of B. It means that we have a Venn diagram for A and B that maybe looks something like this. All right, I've got a set A. Maybe I'll draw it as this little circle here. And if A is a subset of B, then the picture that should come to our minds is that A is entirely contained within B. So the picture that we often use for subsets is a picture that looks like this, right? I cannot be an element of A unless I am also an element of B. And if I expand that sentence out a little bit, I can write it actually in one of two ways. And we're going to actually talk about both of these different kinds of ways of reasoning as we go into the last half of our stream today. I could write it as if I am an element of A. So if I'm inside the orange circle, then I am an element of B. I'm inside the brown circle. That's why this diagram is so helpful, right? Is that there's no way in this visual here for us to locate an element inside of the orange circle unless that element is also within the brown circle, the brown oval, whatever, right? If I'm an element of A, then I'm an element, sorry, not elephant. It's been a long day. Then I am also an element of B. So what I want to draw your attention to here, first of all, are the words if and then. Because those are the only two words in the sentence that I just wrote up here that are not part of a logical proposition. In fact, what they do is that they divide this sentence into two clauses, each of which is a logical proposition. I am an element of A. That's a logical proposition. I am an element of B. That's a logical proposition. Right? So this sentence that I wrote up here contains two logical propositions. And it also contains that framing if-then that's sitting around it. So maybe let's use Q and R in this example now. So I have two propositions, Q and R. And I have an if-then that conjoins them together. If-then. Logicians would call this a conditional. Sometimes called hypothetical. So if you took the philosophy, logical reasoning course, they might have called these hypothetical propositions. But we call them in math conditional statements. One of the challenges about taking both of those courses is we talk all about a lot of the same stuff, but sometimes we use different words to describe them. But it's all the same. And the symbol that's most often used to represent an if-then is a forward-pointing arrow, Q arrow R. Which sometimes, I catch myself doing this a lot, mathematicians will use a word like implies. It's another sort of, I guess, a watchword or a buzzword that can clue you in to the idea that there is an if-then or a conditional statement that's sitting underneath this. So if I took the Q and the R from my list up here, then Q arrow R as a logical proposition would be if Q, then R. So if I write that out, if I have completed my core curriculum requirements, if I have completed the core, comma, then I have received my bachelor's from BSU. So if then is big business. It shows up a lot in the ways in which we use logical propositions to craft an argument. And a lot of the argument forms that we're going to talk about at the end of today's stream are powered by if-then reasoning. All of the syllogistic forms of reasoning that we're going to talk about include an if-then, either as part of a premise, more often as part of a premise, usually a major premise, or sometimes as part of a conclusion, but usually as part of one of the premises. So the operative question again is, when will this kind of statement be true? What is the burden of proof? If I'm trying to prove that this statement is true, that if I've completed the core, then I've received my bachelor's from BSU, what is my standard of proof? We could also ask the opposite question. When is an if-then statement false? And that's actually where I want to start with our conditional statements, with our if-thens. Because the burden of proof to prove a conditional false, it's a a bit of a narrow keyhole to prove that a conditional statement is false. So let's think about if somebody comes into my courtroom and I'm sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom from them, and they claim, if I complete my core curriculum, then I've received my bachelor's from BSU. And I'm sitting on the other side and saying, how do I poke a hole in that argument? How am I going to prove that the thing that they just said is false? All right, how am I going to prove that wrong? Then what I need to do to prove that that statement is false is I need to show that it's possible to complete the core curriculum and yet not receive my bachelor's from BSU. It's possible for the premise to hold and yet the conclusion not hold. So there's a little more terminology that I just snuck in there on you. Q here is called a premise for this conditional statement. R is called the conclusion. Those are words that mathematical reasoning folks like to use. Your logicians might call a premise an antecedent. And they might call a conclusion a consequent. Don't ask me why we have different names for these, but it might just be so that both philosophers and mathematicians can keep their jobs, to create some specialized knowledge. I don't know. They really do mean the same thing. So if you hear your philosophy professor say one of them, you can translate it into our class, or vice versa. So to prove that this statement is false, what I need to do is demonstrate that it's possible for the premise to be true, while the conclusion is false. Right? So if you claim the statement, if I complete the core, then I get my degree from Bridgewater, I can prove you wrong by finding an example of a student who has completed the core, but who didn't get their bachelor's from BSU. Right? Even one example would be enough to completely poke the hole necessary in your case. Because again, if you have not proven your case to be true, then your case must be false. Right? That's the logical way of life. So the way to falsify an if-then statement is actually entails the proof of a conjunction, right? Notice the word and showed up down here. Right? So the negation of a conditional statement is actually a conjunctive statement. The premise and not the conclusion. Right? Premise true, conclusion false. And that turns out to be the only way to falsify a conditional statement. All other cases, all other truth values for P and Q give us a true conditional statement. And that's another place where conditionals get to be a little bit challenging. So here's kind of what I'm trying to say. Let me make some more room at the top of the screen here. Because this is a piece of thinking about conditional logic that throws everybody for a loop the first time that they think about it. I'm going to do my best to try and demystify. So I want to use this diagram, this subset diagram, to help explain what's going on here. So again, this subset diagram is a visual representation of the assertion that says, if I am an element of A, then I am an element of B. If this statement is true, then there are three sort of different places that I can demonstrate the truth of this statement. I can demonstrate the truth of this statement here inside of the set A. Okay? So I'm going to call this location X. So is an element of A, and also of B. Right? So in the case of X, we would have the premise, let me write it this way. In the case of X, we would say that the premise is true and the conclusion is true. Premise true, conclusion true. Right? Because X belongs to A, it also belongs to B. But there's other places where we could put elements inside of this weird Venn diagram. Like if I write the letter Y right here in my diagram, then what can I say about the premise and the conclusion in the case of Y? Well, Y is not in A, and it is in B. So Y is an example of an element for which the premise of this conditional statement is false, and the conclusion is true. But that's okay, right? Because my diagram still shows that A is a subset of B. It still shows that this hypothetical statement, this conditional proposition, if I'm an element of A, then I'm an element of B, this statement is still true for my Venn diagram, even though I might have a Y sitting here, which is not an element of A, and so for which the premise is not true. So denying the premise, or denying the antecedent, which is how a logician would say it, is okay as long as we are, well, it's okay in general, right? Because nothing that's outside of the set A is going to give me evidence for or against the truth of this conditional statement. And that's the key observation, that nothing that resides outside of the set A, nothing outside of the world in which the premise is true, can give us any evidence one way or another to the truth value of a conditional statement. That includes a Z, for example, for which both premise and conclusion are false. Not in A and not in B. And so premise and conclusion are both false. But the conditional statement is still true. Because again, my Venn diagram still shows that if anything is an element of A, it must also be an element of B. And so that's why I say that the only way to show that this conditional statement is false would be to find an example of a situation in which the premise is true, but the conclusion is not. And so that would require me to find an element of A which is not an element of B. So my burden of proof for that would be that I would somehow have to find an example of something. So anything which resides right here, this would falsify the conditional statement. Right? If I could show that there is some element of A which turns out not to be an element of B, then it would not be true that if I'm an element of A, then I'm an element of B. So these are the four types of connectives. There's one other way to convey this sort of subset kind of information. That's going to transition us into our last topic for today. I do want to do maybe one more example of using these logical connectives before we take that step forward. Before I do that, I do want to pause for about 15 or 20 seconds or so in the stream and ask if you're watching this live and have any questions that you have over what we've just said. Please contribute those into the Slack channel if you're one of my current students, or into the Twitch chat if you're watching from outside of our class this semester. And we're going to start again in about 45 seconds. So at the 52-minute mark, we will resume with our example and our last phase of today's live stream. All right, so before we move on to quantified statements and valid forms of argument, let's just look at one more example together of how to use the conjunctions, the connectives rather, to turn old logical propositions into new ones. So what I want to do is just take a moment and sort of diagram out a logical proposition. And the proposition I want for us to consider reads as follows. Some Republican voters did not support the president's immigration plan. So this is a logical proposition. This is something that is testable. We can either demonstrate there exists sufficient evidence somewhere to demonstrate whether this is definitely a true statement or definitely a false statement. Of course, we would have to define our terms. Who are the Republican voters? What does support mean? What is the immigration plan that was being considered? We would have to agree on all of those things before we try to assess this claim logically. But for the moment, we'll assume that we do all of that stuff. I mean, you can look at places like 538 or other online polling organizations. This is what political sort of market research and polling companies do. This is how they make their living, is by defining these terms very carefully, operationalizing them in ways that will help them compare their results to other polls across the rest of the country, and then actually conducting the surveys to gather the evidence for propositions such as this one. So this is definitely a logical proposition, but I want to do a few things with it. I want to think about what is the burden of proof to prove this statement, to prove this is true. What kind of evidence would we need? To prove that this is false, what kind of evidence would we need? Because this is also going to get us into the topic of logical quantifiers when we get there. But the first thing I want to do is to look at this statement and see if there's a way for us to turn it into one of these logical forms that we saw in a previous slide here. Is there a way for us to see it as a compound proposition made up of more than one piece joined together with one of these connectives, either an and, an or, a not, or an if-then? So to do that, I'm just going to look into the sentence and figure out, well, what are the key ingredients that are being discussed here? One key ingredient seems to be Republican voters. So maybe I can take that and turn it into one of my logical propositions. Let me call it P. And maybe the proposition is, I am a Republican voter. That too is a logical proposition as soon as we both agree on what it means to be a voter. Does it mean you voted Republican in the last election? Does it mean that you're a likely voter in this election and would support a Republican? Whatever. And one of the first things that a place like a polling firm like 538 does is they set down those definitions before they go and ask any survey questions. So once they do that, they have established this as a logical proposition, something that for a given person either is a true statement or is a false statement. Okay, the second ingredient seems to be support for the president's immigration plan. And so let's make that our second proposition, Q. I support the president's immigration plan. Again, once as a pollster or whoever decides on how to define that support, does it mean you ask that person a certain set of questions? Does it mean you look at other aspects of their voting history or their lives that might indicate support? Whatever. However we define that, once we define that, this becomes a logical proposition. Either somebody can be said to support the plan or somebody can be said not to support the plan. Okay. And the other ingredient that I see when I look at this sentence is the word not. So somehow the logical content of this involves a negation, not. And what's being negated here is the phenomenon of support for the president's immigration plan, which we have operationalized as Q. So there's a not Q going on in here. And then there is the premise that somebody is a Republican voter. Let's say that that's P. And the assertion, the missing link here that we're going to talk much more in depth on over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes is this word here, some. So that word didn't make our list of different types of logical connectives a few minutes ago. It's not obviously an and, an or, a not, or an if-then. So we're going to want to think about this perhaps separately. Let me just write this over here. Some P, so some Republican voters, satisfy P and not Q. So let me put the word and in here. So one of the ways of understanding the logical content of this assertion is that if we think of the propositions P and Q as being I'm a Republican voter, I support the president's immigration plan, then the compound proposition P and not Q is one way of thinking about what's being said here, right? I'm a Republican and I do not support the president's immigration plan. That's how we would translate this back into this English sentence. I'm a voter and I didn't support the plan, right? But the word some here sort of adds some more complexity to the puzzle. And so I want to use this as an example to begin thinking about the idea of logical quantifiers. So this is an example here of a statement that includes a word, some, that sort of tells me that this statement might be true in some cases, but it doesn't have to be true in all cases, right? And so that word is an example of what we call a quantifier. And quantifiers come in three forms. There are three different ways to quantify an assertion. There's really two, but it sounds like three. One way is to use the word some. And just like in English, some has the connotation that it is not none, but it's not necessarily all. So, not none, but not necessarily all. None and all being the other two logical quantifiers. So, at one end of the spectrum, none. At the other end of the spectrum is all. And in between is some, right? So this sounds almost childish saying it this way. But what it does is it establishes, when you use a logical quantifier, it establishes a burden of proof. How would I prove that some Republican voters did not support the president's immigration plan? Well, if I wanted to prove that statement is true, how many examples do I need? How many instances of the logical statement P and not Q are sufficient to prove that some Republican voters did not support the president's immigration plan? Well, as some implies, some is not none. So there has to be at least one. At least one example where the proposition is true. So very often, even mathematicians, when they're writing, will replace the word some with the words at least one inside of their argument, just to be really explicit about what the burden of proof is. So if I wanted to prove that some Republican voters did not support the president's immigration plan, to prove that that's true, all I really need to do is find one. I could find more if I wanted to, right? But I don't have to. My burden of proof is just to find a single one. If I can go out to the voting population of America, go out to the diners of Des Moines, and ask a bunch of Republican voters, hey, did you support the president's plan? Hey, did you support the plan? Hey, did you support the plan? As soon as I find one person who says no, I can go back and write this headline. Some Republican voters did not support the president's immigration plan. I only found one of them, but that's enough, logically speaking, to prove this quantified statement. Find one Republican voter who did not support the immigration plan. Again, pretty low burden of proof, logically speaking. As soon as I find one person, one example of this statement being true, then the sum, sometimes called the existential quantifier, because all we have to do is establish existence. If we can establish the existence of one case in which the statement is true, then the existentially quantified statement is true. I just have to find one case. Of course, the burden, if the statement were all instead of some, is very much different. If I had went up here and just changed some to all, think about how qualitatively different that statement is. All Republican voters did not support the president's immigration plan. That would mean that every single example that I looked at, every single Republican voter that I asked in the diners of Des Moines would have to say, I didn't support it, I didn't support it, I didn't support it. Every single one. And that's a very high burden of proof. We call those quantifiers universal. In order to prove a universal quantifier is true, we need to show that the proposition is true in every instance. Right? And the same thing would actually be true if we use the word no at the beginning of this. No is also a type of a universal quantifier. No Republican voters didn't support the president's immigration plan. If I wanted to prove that were true, I would have to go again to every single Republican voter out there and ask, did you support the plan? And I need to get a yes answer from all of them in this case to show that no voters did not support the plan. That's the same as showing that all voters did support the plan. That's why I say that both none and all serve as universal quantifiers. To prove that the none quantifier is true, we need to show the proposition is false in every case. So there's really only two flavors of quantifiers at the end of the day. Existential quantifiers, for which the word some or the phrase at least one, is a common way of expressing. And then universal quantifiers, words like all or none, all or nothing, 0 or 1. Either everyone says yes or everyone says no. So coming back to our statement here, some Republican voters didn't support the president's immigration plan. If proving that true only requires me to find one Republican voter that says, yeah, I didn't support the plan, if that's enough for me to prove it true, if I'm on the opposite side of that courtroom, or I guess newsroom, how would I prove that this statement is false? In order to show that some Republican voters didn't support the immigration plan is false, I would need to go ask all of the Republican voters in Iowa or whatever, and they would all have to tell me that they did support the president's immigration plan. And that turns the negation of an existential claim into a universal claim. To prove that this statement is false, I need to show that all Republican voters, well, let me not write it as all first. Let me think about it the other way around. Use the other universal quantifier. If it's not true that some voters didn't support the plan, then it must be true that no Republican voters didn't support the plan. Right? So I'd have to go ask everybody, and every Republican voter that I asked has to say, no voter that I ask can tell me I didn't support the plan. In other words, every voter that I ask has to say that they did. Right? So this is the way to translate between the none and all formulations of a quantified statement. This is a common place for people to get their brains turned around because the language, the English language of this is kind of clumsy. But the way to go back and forth between these two worlds is as follows. And this is going to be a little grammatically weird. None is the same as saying all are not. Those two are equivalent logical propositions. Right? So to say that no Republican voters did not support the plan, which is what I set up here, that'd be the same as saying all of them did support the plan. So whenever you see the quantifier none inside of a logical proposition, I find it's best practice to turn nones into alls every time, just because it helps you to focus on what exactly is the burden of proof here. If I'm going to go out and ask all the Republican voters, what answers do I need to hear, right, from them? To prove that this claim up here is false, I would need to ask all Republican voters, and they all should tell me that they did support the president's immigration plan. That would prove that the statement I wrote up here in the corner is false. So something else we notice is that a existential quantifier, when you negate it to prove that an existential is false, it turns into a universal, and vice versa. So the burdens of proof for truth versus falsehood in quantifiers are always going to be opposite. If one of them is universal, the other one's existential, and vice versa. So let's go to another example here. And I'm going to try to strip this down a little bit to its bare essentials here. Let's suppose we say something like, no Math 105 students are majors in mathematics. Setting aside the truth or falsehood of this proposition, it is actually a logical proposition. It's something we can test to be either true, definitely, or false, definitely. So how do we know which it is, or how can we understand what the burden of proof for truth versus falsehood would look like? What I want to do is I actually want to use a visual aid to communicate this idea. And that visual aid is called an Euler diagram. So how do we use Euler diagrams to organize our thoughts about quantified statements? So here is a statement: no Math 105 students are majors in mathematics. On the one hand, I could turn this into a pair of logical propositions, let's say P and Q, where maybe P is the statement, I am a Math 105 student, and Q is the statement, I major in mathematics. And then the logical content of this assertion is to say that no P's are Q. No Math 105 students are math majors. But it might be more natural. Instead of thinking about P and Q from the point of view of logical propositions, it might be more natural to think of them as assertions about sets. And that's the observation that gives us a tool to use a visual representation, because we have this great visual language for thinking about sets in the Venn diagrams that we've spent the last couple of weeks using. So what I want to do is to use a Venn-like diagram to depict this assertion. So the other way to do this might be to define two sets. A is the set of Math 105 students. And let's say B is the set of math majors. And then I would just try to draw a Venn diagram that communicates the information in my quantified proposition, no P are Q. So another way to say that then, right, is that no element of A is an element of B. So I'll write that as belongs to B. Right? So now that we've translated from the language of logical proposition into the language of sets, now we can come up with a Venn diagram. And if I started by drawing my generic MasterCard logo Venn diagram, that would be one way of getting at this. Here's the set A, there are my Math 105 students. Here's the set B, those are my math majors. And the content of this assertion, that no element of A, nothing which is inside the red circle, is also inside the purple circle, the logical content of that would just be to deny the existence of any elements in this overlapping portion. So you might just kind of shade this part out and say there's nothing here. Right? So we've excluded the middle of this Venn diagram. That's one way of depicting what's going on here. So I cannot now place an element in this Venn diagram in a fashion where it belongs to both sets. But I think it's even easier to communicate what we're trying to communicate if we just take our two sets, A and B, and we just separate them visually from one another. So rather than even allowing them to overlap at all, we can just draw them like this. Right? So that, again, it's still not possible for me to place any element inside this diagram in a way such that it belongs to such that an element of A belongs to B. Okay. On the other hand, we may or may not want to draw it in this fashion, but I think it's more common as we start to use these kinds of diagrams, which we're now going to start calling Euler diagrams. When we use these diagrams to assess arguments, I think it's pretty common not to use the standard MasterCard logo Venn diagram to do this, but to try and separate those sets which are legitimately disjoint, which is what mathematicians would call this arrangement of two sets that have no elements in common, as well as to arrange subsets visually as well, so that all of one of them is drawn inside of the other. So we can sort of supercharge our visual aid to help us with that communication in an Euler diagram whenever we can. So no P are Q. No Math 105 students are majors in mathematics. And that's what this diagram here would communicate. If I wanted to also turn this into into a positive statement rather than a negative statement, rather than saying no something, I'd much rather say all something. Just remember that no are, or no is, turns into all are not. So the other way to think about this is all P are not Q. All Math 105 students are not majors in mathematics. It would be the equivalent statement that's there. Okay, so this would be an Euler diagram. There's no way for me to place somebody inside of the A circle. No way to identify a Math 105 student that also places them inside of the purple circle, the set of math majors. So we can use this diagram to assess whether or not an argument is being made in valid form. And that's the last skill that we're going to talk about with our last 10 or 15 minutes today. So how do we decide whether or not an argument is valid? First, I think we have to agree on what valid is going to mean. So an argument is valid. It's a different thing than true, by the way. An argument, first of all, because it's also our first time using the word argument here, an argument is something which has premises, and it has conclusions, antecedents and consequences, if you like. And it may have more than one premise, but whatever. And when we diagram out an argument, usually we'll put the conclusions underneath the horizontal line. It's a bit like when you're doing an addition problem in second grade or whatever, and you're writing 242 plus 91, and then underneath of a horizontal line, you place the sum that you get, whatever that happens to be, 333, right? So it's a bit like the notation is drawing the analogy between the sort of the elements that go into my problem, my premises, and then the conclusion, the thing that we produce from those premises. So that's why the notation is kind of set up the way that it is. And so that's what an argument does, is it sets up some premises. And the function, the role of the premises are things that we accept, however tentatively. We accept that those premises are true. And that's something that when you're discussing a logical argument with somebody, that levels the playing field, right? And often what somebody on the other side of a logical argument will have to do is say something like, all right, I will grant you that these premises are true. Okay? Because then the burden of proof on the person making the logical argument is to then demonstrate to demonstrate that this conclusion, demonstrate that these must be true, whenever the premises are true. So really what an argument is it's a giant conditional proposition, or hypothetical proposition. So it's really a big if P then Q kind of statement, right? The premises imply the conclusions. Right? That's the assertion that's being made in an argument. And so the burden of proof for somebody demonstrating that their argument is valid is to show why whenever the premises are true, the conclusions must be true, that there's no other way for that to happen. And so an argument form is said to be valid if whenever the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So is the conclusion. So the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Right? That's what it means for the form of an argument to be valid. And philosophers and logicians will stress that validity is a formal construct. It's not about whether your premises are true. It's not about whether the conclusion is true. It's about whether your argument is drawn up in a way that demonstrates that whenever the premises are true, the conclusions must also be true as a result. So let's take a look at some common forms of valid argumentation. So if I were to make the following claim. So we'll go back to the claim from the previous screen. No Math 105 students are majors in mathematics. No 105 students are math majors. And we take that as a premise. In other words, for the sake of this discussion, you and I will both agree on the truth of this proposition. We'll agree that it's true that there's no 105 students that are math majors. We'll call this P. And this is sometimes called the major premise. It's the first premise that we place in our argument form. And then usually we'll add in another premise as well to combine with that premise. So here's another one. Let's say I am not a math major. Call that Q. Sometimes that's called a minor premise. There's a little bit less going on. It's not quantified. Very often that second premise that gets listed is less complicated than the first. So we might call the first one major, the second one minor, whatever. So again, the purpose here in the argument is that we're going to assume that both of these statements are true. That no 105 students are math majors, and that I am not a math major. And then underneath this horizontal line, sometimes we'll place these three little dots. Mathematicians love these little dots. This is just an abbreviation for the word therefore. It's meant to indicate what the conclusion is supposed to be, right? Therefore, let's figure out, let me just write down a possible conclusion here. Therefore, I am a Math 105 student. So this is an argument, right? It gives me two premises. No 105 students are math majors, and I am not a math major. And it gives me a purported conclusion. Therefore, I am a 105 student. Right? Each of these is a logical proposition. And what the assertion is that whenever my two premises hold, so whenever P is true and Q is true, then R must be true. So that's the form of this argument. That's the way in which this argument is being structured. And so our goal is to figure out whether the conclusion must follow from the premises. If the premises are true, must the conclusion be true? Or is it possible for the conclusion not to hold? So an Euler diagram is, for me at least, the best tool for assessing these claims. So let's see how we can use this Euler diagram to assess the validity of this reasoning. I'm going to move it over to this screen here. So here's my Euler diagram. And this Euler diagram, by the way, is communicating the premise P. So I'm just going to put P here kind of as my, well, maybe I actually color the rectangle orange here. So this rectangle is communicating premise P. And then premise Q says, I am not a math major. So premise Q would be a way of locating me inside of this diagram. The set A are my 105 students. 105 students. The set B are my math majors. And premise Q says that I am in, I suppose you could say, B complement in this Euler diagram. I reside outside of B. So one way of thinking about what that premise can look like is I'm just going to kind of shade everything outside of B. And I'm just going to kind of write over here, I am here. Right? I'm somewhere in that green shaded region. So now let's look at the conclusion. So this diagram now conveys the truth of both of the premises. So I used both premises to construct this diagram. Is it necessarily true that I am a 105 student? So given that I am in this green area, must I be inside of the set A? And so how I would answer that question is no. if I'm in this green region, there's actually two places that I can be in my Euler diagram. I could be in position 1 or I could be in position 2. If I'm at 1, then R is true. Then I am a Math 105 student because I'm inside of the red circle. But if I'm in position 2, R is false. If I'm right here, then it's still true that I'm not a math major, but it's also false that I'm a Math 105 student. So just saying that I'm not a math major is not enough to guarantee that I'm not a Math 105 student. And so I've found an instance under which this conclusion is false. Therefore, since the truth of the conclusion need not follow from the truth of the premises, that means that this form of reasoning is invalid. There is a way for the premises to hold and the conclusion to fail. And that is why this is an invalid form of argument. So sketching an Euler diagram that conveys all the information from your premises is the most powerful thing you can do. Once your Venn diagram, your Euler diagram is set up, then all you have to do is look at your conclusion and say, all right, do I need to believe this conclusion based on the Euler diagram that I just sketched? In this example, that answer is no, I don't need to believe this conclusion. This conclusion says that I must be inside the Math 105 circle, but there is a way in which I might not be in my Euler diagram. Therefore, this is an invalid form of reasoning. Let's do one more example of this to wrap up today's live stream, because using Euler diagrams to assess the validity of arguments is definitely a skill that's going to take a lot of practice. So our last example today. Let's assess the following argument. I'm going to take one out of another textbook here real quick. So let's see whether or not it's a valid form of reasoning to say the following. If I enjoy reading, then I appreciate language. So there's one premise, and here this premise is a conditional proposition. And another proposition would be to say some people enjoy reading. And then underneath this line, I'm going to write my conclusion, my supposed conclusion. Therefore, some people enjoy language. Let's figure out if this is a valid form of argument. So let me take a moment and just shrink this down a little bit so we can identify our premises, our conclusions. We'll sketch a nice Euler diagram for this, and then we will be able to use that Euler diagram to assess the validity. So I'm going to call this first premise a compound logical proposition because it has the if-then language in it to indicate that it actually is a conditional. P implies Q, where P might be the proposition I enjoy reading, Q the proposition I appreciate language. So this is P implies Q. Then in the second premise, it says that some people enjoy reading. So maybe people might be, if I am a person, there are some persons, let's say R is persons, and enjoy reading, Q. Okay. And then the conclusion here is something like R and P. Right. Let's sketch an Euler diagram to, again, convey the truth of the premises. And then we'll wrap up. So I'm going to think of P as being corresponded to the set of people who enjoy reading. So I'll write this here as enjoys reading. So there's that set. And then I've got Q, the set of people who appreciate language. But because P implies Q, what we're saying is that the set of people who enjoy reading is a subset of the set of people who enjoy language. And so that gives me this Euler diagram here. Language. Just give me 1 second. I'll be out of like less than 5 minutes.
Okay, cool.
Ready to go. So you can see how we've kind of turned this into a Venn diagram, where the first of our two premises, our major premise here, is encoded as a subset relationship. The set of people who enjoy reading is a subset of the set of people who enjoy language. And so I put the reading set inside of the language set to convey that information. That's what makes this an Euler diagram instead of a MasterCard logo Venn diagram. Okay, now I have to think about what's happening here. Some people enjoy reading. So whatever my set of people might happen to look like, I'm not going to draw it in for good, but whatever my set of people, there's at least somebody who is both a person and who enjoys reading. So in particular, it means that the intersection of the set of people with the set of those who enjoy reading, reading, I got these backwards here, sorry. The set of those who enjoy reading and the set of those who are people intersect one with another. The intersection of the green set of people and the red set of those who enjoy reading is not an empty set. So if here's my people, I know for sure that there's at least one person, at least one element which belongs to both the green set and the red set. In other words, where the red and green sets overlap. So the way that I'll convey that is to just draw in one element right here. Here's a person. There is definitely a person that belongs to that set of people who enjoy reading. And so the question now is it true that some people enjoy language? So this diagram now gives me both of my premises. My major and minor premises are encoded in this diagram. So now I need to ask the question, does this diagram prove that some people enjoy language? Must the conclusion be true once we accept that the premises are true? So is there a person, an element of the set R, who is also someone that enjoys language, and therefore an element of this blue set? And in this example, we have to conclude that the answer is yes. Because this person who enjoys reading, whose existence we are guaranteed by that second premise, some people enjoy reading, this person that we placed inside of the reading circle, because the reading circle is a subset of the language circle, because of the first premise, that means that this person who enjoys reading also is a person who enjoys language. And therefore, this form of argument is valid. Because there must be a person who enjoys language in this case. Because there's a person who enjoys reading, and everyone who enjoys reading also enjoys language. So getting some practice with sketching these Euler diagrams is definitely going to take a while to do, but I think it's probably the most valuable skill that we get at the end of the day in thinking about logical reasoning. It's being able to look at a logical argument and decide whether or not it is valid in form, meaning that if my interlocutor can convince me that the premises are true, then if it's a valid argument, I must also be convinced that the conclusion is true, that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. A valid argument form is a form that establishes that. An invalid form, like we looked at on the last slide, is any example of an argument form where it is possible for the premises to be true, but the conclusion not to be true. Once you have your diagram in place, ask yourself very carefully, must I believe this conclusion? Or is there any possibility that this conclusion might not hold? And that's exactly the question that will differentiate valid forms of argument from invalid forms of argument. And that's going to wrap up Logic Week for us. Where we're going to go next, if you're a student in the class this semester, we've just wrapped up our first unit of the course this week with topic number 3. It's our units on sets, set operations, logical reasoning, and logical argument. And so next week, is going to be a week where we take a step back and prepare to submit an exam on that whole batch of material. So you'll have quiz 3 to complete at the end of this week, and there'll be exam 1 coming up next week. So Newton Alta, your online homework system, is going to be changing a little bit to focus increasingly over the next few days on review material. So it's going to start feeding you opportunities to review. There's going to be an assignment inside of Newton Alta that's called a test, but it's not actually a test. It's just a review for the test. The test happens on pencil and paper, just like your quizzes do. But that review assignment inside of Newton Alta is a great way to look back at the previous material you've already mastered to get ready for that test when it comes along. After that test, when we get to 2 weeks from now, we're going to be into our brand new unit on using algebra to model behavior, model real-world phenomena, and looking at how to use algebra as a way to convey information about data. That's going to be our second unit in the course, once we get through our first unit on sets and logical reasoning. So I look forward to that with you. Next week, as opposed to a live stream to talk about new material, what I'll be doing is a live stream review session. So the best way to interact with that is as you're working on some of those review problems, do contribute questions. If there's particular sticky topics or sticky problems you want us to look at, contribute those into the Slack channel before the live stream next week, and we'll use the live stream to do a review.